The Second World War was the most devastating conflict in history, but despite the millions of pages written, it still holds secrets that neither the passage of time nor the declassified archives have been able to clarify. What really happened to some of the treasures looted by the Nazis? Are there experimental weapons hidden in forgotten bunkers? What fate befell certain officers who disappeared without a trace? Behind every battle and every treaty, there are shadows, mysteries, and enigmas that challenge official memory. This documentary will not speak of what you already know, but of what is still hidden. The uncomfortable questions, the forbidden stories, the war secrets that still await revelation. 25 mysteries of the Second World War still unsolved. History has not been able to explain them. Hitler's Ark. During the Second World War, countless stories arose that, as decades passed, became enigmas without definitive answers. One of the most intriguing is the one known as Hitler's Ark, the supposed obsession of the Third Reich with finding and taking possession of the Ark of the Covenant described in the Bible. According to tradition, this sacred object not only contained the tablets of the Law of Moses, but also radiated a power capable of destroying entire armies and granting invincibility to whoever possessed it. For Hitler, and especially for Heinrich Himmler, leader of the SS, this was not a simple religious story, but a real possibility of obtaining a supernatural weapon that would ensure the victory of the Reich. With this objective, the Ahnenerbe was founded, an institute created to track ancient relics and archaeological remains that could have spiritual or mystical value. Among the destinations of these expeditions were places steeped in tradition, such as Ethiopia, where the Orthodox Church claims that the Ark rests in the city of Aksum. Searches are also mentioned in Montserrat, in Spain, in Bavarian castles, and even in Austrian caves, where the Nazis hid confiscated treasures. Part of the archives of these operations disappeared at the end of the war, which fueled the myth that some discovery might have been deliberately concealed. Although the Allies found countless secret depots filled with works of art, ritual objects, and confiscated relics, they never found evidence of the Ark of the Covenant. Nevertheless, witnesses of the time claimed that Himmler and other leaders experimented with sacred symbols such as the Spear of Longinus, which according to tradition pierced Christ's side. The enigma of Hitler's Ark lies not only in whether it was found or not, but in what it reveals about Nazism, a regime capable of mixing political ideology, science, and esotericism in its pursuit of absolute power. A mystery that still today continues to raise questions and reminds us how even in the modern era, the fascination with the occult could guide decisions with devastating historical consequences. The fate of Martin Bormann. During the Second World War, and especially in the final days of the Third Reich, one of the great enigmas was the fate of Martin Bormann, the man who became Adolf Hitler's shadow and the most powerful bureaucrat in Nazi Germany. As head of the party chancellery and Hitler's personal secretary, Bormann controlled access to the Führer, filtered information, and wielded immense power behind the scenes. However, when Berlin fell in 1945, his whereabouts became a mystery that fueled decades of theories and speculations. On the 1st of May of 1945, after Hitler's suicide in the bunker, Bormann tried to flee Berlin together with a small group of high-ranking Nazis. According to some testimonies, he died that same night near the Chter train station, possibly struck by the explosion of a Soviet projectile or by ingesting poison to avoid capture. Nevertheless, for a long time, no remains were found to confirm that version, which opened the door to rumors of successful escapes. In the following years, reports began to circulate, placing him in countries as distant as Argentina, Paraguay, Brazil, and even the Soviet Union. Some witnesses claimed to have seen him in South America, protected by networks of ex-Nazis and fascist sympathizers, while others claimed he had been secretly captured by the Soviets. The Mossad, the Israeli intelligence service, even investigated these versions during the 1960s, in parallel with its pursuit of Nazi criminals such as Adolf Eichmann. The uncertainty began to clear in 1972, when during excavations in Berlin, human remains were found near the former Chter station. Forensic analyses of the time suggested that they corresponded to Bormann, although many distrusted this, thinking it was a ruse to close the case. It was not until 1998 that DNA tests officially confirmed that those remains did indeed belong to Martin Bormann, certifying that he had died in Berlin in 1945. Even so, the myth persists. For many, the idea that one of the most influential men of Nazism disappeared without a trace for decades continues to fuel conspiracy theories. The fate of Bormann is remembered not only as a historical enigma, but also as an example of how the shadow of Nazism continued to project itself long after the war, blending reality, myth, and propaganda in one of the most intriguing stories of the 20th century. The case of the Nazi man in the Iron Mask. Among the most disturbing enigmas that arose after the Second World War is the case of the so-called Nazi man in the Iron Mask, a nickname inspired by the famous French figure of the 17th century, but applied to an anonymous prisoner who aroused doubts, theories, and suspicions for decades. According to various testimonies, in the early years of the post-war period, the story spread of a mysterious inmate linked to Nazism, who was allegedly kept in conditions of absolute secrecy, isolated and hidden from public opinion, always under strict custody, and with his identity jealously protected. The most disturbing aspect was the claim that this prisoner wore a metal or leather mask to cover his face, preventing anyone from recognizing him. The speculations about his identity were countless. Some maintained that he could have been a high Nazi officer who had survived the fall of the Reich and whose capture had not been revealed for political reasons. Among the most repeated names appeared Heinrich Müller, head of the Gestapo, whose disappearance remains a mystery, Rudolf Hess, although officially imprisoned in Spandau, or even figures such as Martin Bormann before his death was confirmed. For others, that masked man might have been a double, a spy, or someone with information too sensitive about secret pacts between Nazis and Allied powers. The case, although shrouded in shadows and without conclusive official documentation, was fueled by accounts from veterans, journalists, and writers who claimed to have heard rumors about this phantom prisoner in prisons in Germany, Austria, or even the Soviet Union. Some claim that he may have been under Soviet control, which would explain the silence and the lack of records, since Moscow was accustomed to hiding strategic information about its enemies. The truth is that to this day there is no definitive proof of the real existence of this character. However, the myth of the Nazi man in the Iron Mask embodies the distrust, secrecy, and conspiracies that surrounded the end of the war. It also represents the possibility that certain truths about the Third Reich never came to light and remain buried in still classified archives. The Amber Treasure. The Amber Treasure, also known as the mythical Amber Room, is one of the great mysteries that still surround the Second World War. Considered a unique work of art, it was composed of panels of carved amber, sheets of gold, and precious stones that decorated an entire hall in the Catherine Palace near St. Petersburg. Its origin dates back to the 18th century, when the King of Prussia gave it to Tsar Peter the Great as a symbol of friendship between the two powers. For more than 2 centuries, it was admired as the 8th wonder of the world for its splendor and incalculable value. In 1941, with the German invasion of the Soviet Union, the Amber Room became a target of the Nazi army. Experts sent by Hitler dismantled each panel with extreme care and packed them into dozens of boxes that were transported to the city of Königsberg, now Kaliningrad. There it remained on display in a museum under German control until 1944, when the advance of the Red Army and the intense Allied bombings put the city in jeopardy. It was at that moment that the treasure disappeared without a trace. The versions about its fate are multiple and contradictory. Some claim that it was destroyed in the fires of Königsberg, while others maintain that the Nazis hid it in secret mines, castles, or even that it was shipped on vessels sunk in the Baltic Sea. Over the decades, treasure hunters, archaeologists, and even governments have organized expeditions to find the lost haul, but without success. Only a few isolated pieces, recovered on the black market or in private collections, have appeared, feeding the legend even more. To restore its splendor, Russia undertook the reconstruction of the Amber Room in the Catherine Palace, a titanic work that was completed in 2003 after more than 20 years of effort. However, the fate of the original remains a mystery. Did it turn to ashes in the bombings, or does it still rest intact in some forgotten hiding place? The enigma of the Amber Treasure continues to be one of the most fascinating and enigmatic stories of the Second World War. The mystery of the American ship Indianapolis. The sinking of the Indianapolis is one of the most tragic and at the same time enigmatic episodes of the Second World War. This heavy cruiser of the United States Navy had a secret mission in 1945 to transport key components for the construction of the first atomic bomb that would be dropped on Hiroshima. The operation had to be carried out with the greatest possible discretion, so the ship sailed practically without escort or anti-submarine protection. It successfully completed the delivery of its mysterious cargo on the island of Tinian, but the real drama began on its return voyage. On the 30th of July of 1945, in the waters of the Pacific, the Indianapolis was struck by 2 torpedoes fired by a Japanese submarine, the I-58. The explosion split the cruiser and caused it to sink in barely 12 minutes, without time to send an effective distress signal. Of the nearly 1,200 men on board, about 300 went down with the ship, while nearly 900 were left adrift in the middle of the ocean, without adequate lifeboats, with little food and few life jackets. What followed was a nightmare of several days. The survivors faced sunstroke, dehydration, and delirium, but the most terrifying were the shark attacks that fed on the bodies in the water. When they were finally rescued, almost 5 days later, only 316 men were still alive. The delay in the rescue unleashed one of the greatest controversies of the post-war period. How was it possible for an American cruiser to disappear without anyone searching for it for days? Here lies the true mystery. Some maintain that the silence surrounding the disappearance of the Indianapolis was due to the secret nature of its mission, since the United States could not risk revealing that it had transported the atomic bomb. Others believe there was negligence in the chain of command, as the requests for escort had been ignored and the information about the ship's route was not correctly updated. The captain, Charles McVeigh, was even blamed and subjected to a court-martial, accused of not maneuvering in zigzag to avoid the torpedoes, although years later he was exonerated and recognized as a victim of injustice. Decades later, in 2017, the remains of the ship Indianapolis were found on the seabed at more than 5,000 meters of depth. Even so, the case remains surrounded by enigmas. Was there a cover-up by the Naval High Command to hide mistakes? Was the sacrifice of the ship a calculated cost to keep the Manhattan Project secret? The truth is that the tragedy of the Indianapolis is remembered not only for the suffering of its men, but also for the questions that still persist about one of the darkest and most chilling chapters of the war in the Pacific. The Lost Nazi Gold. The lost Nazi gold is one of the most persistent and darkest enigmas of the Second World War, a story that combines looting, greed, and mystery. Throughout the conflict, the Third Reich carried out one of the greatest plundering operations in modern history. It was not only about works of art and cultural goods stolen from the occupied territories, but also about immense quantities of gold, cash, jewelry, and precious metals confiscated from national banks, persecuted Jewish families, and victims of concentration camps. This loot was transported in trains, trucks, and airplanes, then stored in secret vaults or transferred to European banks that collaborated with the regime. The gold was used to finance Hitler's war machine and maintain the Reich's international transactions despite the economic blockade imposed by the Allies. However, when defeat became inevitable and Germany lay in ruins, part of these reserves mysteriously disappeared. The Nazis tried to hide or move the treasure so that it would not fall into enemy hands, and since then, multiple theories have arisen about its whereabouts. One of the most widespread rumors speaks of the so-called gold train in Poland, a convoy loaded with tons of ingots, works of art, and secret documents that was supposedly hidden in underground tunnels in the region of Silesia when the Red Army was approaching in 1945. Despite numerous expeditions and excavations, no conclusive proof of its existence has ever been found. Another theory holds that part of the gold was thrown into the Alpine lakes in Bavaria and Austria, such as the Toplitz Sea, where even today divers and treasure hunters continue searching. It has also been speculated that a good part of the Nazi gold ended up in foreign banks, especially in Switzerland, where neutrality allowed transactions with the Reich. Later investigations confirmed that the gold coming from the looted reserves and from the melting of personal belongings of Holocaust victims entered the European financial system, which gave rise to an international controversy that continues to this day. The truth is that although part of the Nazi gold was recovered by the Allies after the war and destined for the reconstruction of Europe, large quantities were never found. Is it still hidden underground in some forgotten tunnel at the bottom of a lake, or safely kept in private vaults? The lost Nazi gold remains a symbol of the shadows of war, reminding us that the ghosts of greed and barbarity can survive far beyond the battles. The fate of Rudolf Hess. Rudolf Hess was one of the men closest to Adolf Hitler in the early years of the Third Reich. As the Führer's lieutenant and a key figure in the National Socialist Party, he had direct access to the most intimate circle of Nazi power. However, his fate became one of the greatest enigmas of the Second World War. In May of 1941, in an unexpected turn, Hess embarked on a solo flight from Germany to Scotland, claiming that his mission was to negotiate peace with the United Kingdom behind Hitler's back. He was immediately captured by the British authorities and imprisoned, becoming a prisoner of high strategic and political value. The mystery begins with the real motivations for his journey. Some maintain that he acted on his own initiative, convinced that he could mediate an agreement between the two powers to unite forces against the Soviet Union. Others believe that Hitler was aware and that the mission was a secret and failed attempt to open a diplomatic channel. The fact that the Nazi regime declared him a traitor shortly afterward fueled even more doubts about what really happened. After the war, Hess was tried in the Nuremberg trials. Sentenced to life imprisonment for crimes against peace and conspiracy, he was sent to Spandau prison in Berlin. There he spent more than 4 decades isolated, guarded by the victorious powers. He became the most famous and longest-lived prisoner of the place, a living symbol of the scars of war. His death in 1987 opened another chapter of mystery. Officially, it was declared that Hess committed suicide by hanging himself in his cell at 93 years of age. However, relatives, sympathizers, and even some investigators have questioned that version, pointing out inconsistencies in the official report and suggesting the possibility that he was murdered to prevent him from revealing compromising secrets. Among the most repeated theories is the idea that he might have been eliminated by Western intelligence services, fearful of what he might say in his final years. The fate of Rudolf Hess remains fertile ground for speculation. Was he an idealist who acted on his own in search of peace, a secret emissary of the Nazi regime, or simply a discarded pawn by Hitler when his plan failed? And above all, did he really die by his own decision, or was he silenced forever? The enigma of Hess continues to inspire books, documentaries, and debates, reminding us that even in the great processes of history, there are always shadows and unanswered questions. The disappearance of the U-530 and U-977 submarines. At the end of the Second World War, 2 German submarines became the center of one of the most intriguing mysteries in naval history, the U-530 and the U-977. Both disappeared from official records after Germany's surrender in May of 1945, and weeks later reappeared under puzzling circumstances in South American waters, thousands of kilometers away from Europe. The U-530, commanded by Otto W&auml, arrived unexpectedly at the port of Mar del Plata, Argentina, on the 10th of July of 1945. It had departed from Norway in April and for months sailed without a clear course, without reporting its position and with unknown orders. When it surrendered to the Argentine authorities, its crew was interrogated by the Allies, who suspected that the submarine might have transported fleeing Nazi leaders, perhaps even Adolf Hitler. Although no conclusive evidence was ever found, the absence of precise explanations about its voyage fueled all kinds of theories. 1 month later, on the 17th of August of 1945, another German submarine, the U-977, under the command of Heinz Schäfer, also appeared in Mar del Plata. Its arrival reinforced the suspicions. Was it possible that both submarines had carried out a secret mission? Schäfer stated that he had decided to flee to South America to avoid immediate surrender, sailing for more than 100 days in extreme conditions, even using the snorkel to remain submerged during much of the journey. According to his version, the crew wanted to surrender in a neutral country, far from devastated Europe. However, the coincidences between both cases unleashed a wave of speculation. In the post-war period, rumors arose about Nazi submarines that might have transported treasures, secret documents, and even high-ranking officers of the Third Reich to refuges in Argentina, Chile, or Antarctica. Some accounts maintain that both the U-530 and the U-977 might have been part of a clandestine operation to evacuate valuable objects or key figures of the regime. Although the official records and the testimonies of their captains point to more conventional explanations, the gaps in their stories keep the doubt alive. What did these submarines really do during the weeks they were missing? Whom or what did they transport, and why did both choose the same South American port to surrender? The disappearance and reappearance of the U-530 and the U-977 remain one of the most mysterious episodes of the end of the Second World War, where the line between documented history and legend continues to blur. Hitler's escape. The death of Adolf Hitler in the Berlin bunker in April of 1945 is one of the most studied episodes in modern history. The official version claims that the Führer committed suicide alongside Eva Braun while the Red Army advanced over the German capital. His remains, according to the Soviets, were found, incinerated, and buried in secret. However, from the very end of the war, doubts and alternative theories arose that have kept the mystery alive for decades. Did he really die in the bunker, or did he manage to escape? The Soviets, who were the first to enter Berlin, kept many of the details about what happened secret. During the Cold War, this lack of transparency fueled rumors in the West about a possible escape. There was talk of secret tunnels under the Chancellery, planes that took off in the final days of the Reich, and even submarines that might have carried him to South America. Argentina, Chile, Brazil, and even Antarctica have been pointed to as possible destinations in various investigations and testimonies. One of the most famous cases is that of the so-called Rat Line, an escape network used by many high-ranking Nazis to flee to South America with the help of sympathizers and clandestine organizations. Figures such as Josef Mengele and Adolf Eichmann actually managed to hide there for years, which fuels the idea that Hitler could have done the same. In 2009, a team of American researchers examined a fragment of skull attributed to Hitler that was kept in Russian archives. The result was surprising. It belonged to a woman under 40 years old, which unleashed a new wave of theories about the possible falsification of evidence. Although the analysis of the jawbone, also in Moscow's possession, did match Hitler's dental records, the debate was not completely closed. The myth of Hitler's escape has been reinforced by books, documentaries, and testimonies from alleged witnesses who claim to have seen him in South America years after the war. However, most historians maintain that these versions lack solid proof and that Hitler indeed died in Berlin in 1945. Even so, the idea of his escape continues to fascinate the public. It represents not only the possibility that one of the most bloodthirsty dictators in history evaded justice, but also the power of secrets, propaganda, and the shadows that still shroud the end of the Third Reich. The enigma of Hitler's escape remains open, oscillating between documented history and the legend that refuses to die. The Nazi Expedition to Antarctica. The Nazi expedition to Antarctica is one of the most enigmatic episodes of the Second World War, and to this day remains surrounded by mystery, speculation, and conspiracy theories. In 1938, under the direct orders of Hermann Göring and with the support of the Nazi regime, the ship Schwabenland departed from Hamburg with the official objective of claiming territories in Antarctica for the Third Reich. The voyage, known as the Neuschwabenland, New Swabia expedition, had geopolitical, strategic, and scientific purposes, but it also left behind a series of questions that have fueled the imagination for decades. The Nazis sent seaplanes that flew over vast areas of Antarctica, dropping flags with the swastika to mark the territory as their own. Documents from the time indicate that they took thousands of aerial photographs and explored the region in search of natural resources, especially whale oil, essential for the production of explosives and lubricants. However, from the end of the war, versions began to circulate that pointed to much darker objectives. Some theories suggest that the Nazis may have established secret bases in subglacial caves, taking advantage of the continent's extreme geography to conceal laboratories, arsenals, and even prototypes of advanced weapons. The most famous legend maintains that after the fall of Berlin in 1945, German submarines transported Nazi officers, scientists, and even relics to that supposed Antarctic base. The myth intensified after the mysterious Operation High Jump, carried out in 1946 to 1947-47 by the United States under Admiral Richard Byrd's command. Officially, it was a training mission in extreme conditions, but the deployment of thousands of men, aircraft carriers, destroyers and fighter planes fueled the suspicion that they sought to confront a Nazi presence on the frozen continent. Byrd even declared in an interview that there existed a threat coming from the poles capable of flying from one end of the world to the other in a short time, which gave rise to countless theories about secret weapons and unknown technology. Although the documented historical evidence only confirms that the Nazi expedition of 1938 to 1939 had a mainly exploratory and propagandistic nature, the information gap about what they really found there keeps the mystery alive. Today, Neuschwabenland is a recurring topic in documentaries, books and forums, where history mixes with speculation. Was it simply an exploration mission, or did a hidden last stronghold of the Third Reich truly exist in Antarctica? Otto Wechter, the Nazi fugitive who died in the shadows of the Vatican. Otto Wechter was one of the most wanted Nazi leaders at the end of the Second World War. As governor of Krakow and later of Galicia, he was directly involved in mass deportations and in the deaths of thousands of people. At the end of the war in 1945, he managed to escape the Allies and took refuge in Austria, living for years in hiding and moving constantly to avoid capture. Like other Nazi fugitives, Wechter sought to reach South America through the rat lines, escape networks that operated in Europe with the help of sympathizers, including members of the church. In 1949, he arrived in Rome under a false identity and contacted Bishop Alois Hudal, known for helping Nazi criminals obtain Red Cross passports to flee to Argentina. Everything seemed to indicate that this would also be his destination, but his story took an unexpected turn. That same year, while still in Rome, Wechter suddenly fell ill. He was hospitalized and died after several days of agony. The official version spoke of a kidney infection and hepatitis, but since then, theories have circulated that he was poisoned. Some point to Soviet agents eliminating him to prevent his escape. Others believe he was silenced by those who feared what he might reveal about the Nazi protection networks. The truth is that Wechter never faced a tribunal nor answered for his crimes. He died in the shadows, protected by contacts and institutions that helped him evade justice. His case remains a disturbing example of how many Nazis found refuge after the war and how, in the Rome of the Vatican and the Cold War, the lines between protection, conspiracy and silence became deeply blurred. The Wunderwaffen. The so-called Wunderwaffen, or wonder weapons, were secret projects developed by Nazi Germany in the final years of the Second World War. Hitler and his high command believed that these revolutionary weapons could change the course of the war when it already seemed lost. Under that obsession, enormous resources were invested in technologies that in many cases were far ahead of their time and that would later influence science and the military industry of the 20th century. Among the best-known Wunderwaffen are the V-1 and V-2 missiles. The first, known as the flying bomb, was used to bomb London and other cities, causing terror with its characteristic buzzing before impact. The V-2, designed by Wernher von Braun, was the first long-range ballistic missile in history. It traveled at great speed and altitude, making it practically impossible to intercept at that time. These weapons, although they did not succeed in reversing Germany's defeat, marked the beginning of the rocket age and were the basis for the later space programs of the United States and the Soviet Union. But the Wunderwaffen were not limited to missiles. There were jet aircraft projects such as the Messerschmitt Me 262, the first of its kind to enter combat. Giant tanks were also designed, such as the Maus, too heavy to be practical, and experimental energy weapons such as sonic cannons or particle rays, which never went beyond the testing phase or even remained in the realm of speculation. The aura of mystery surrounding the Wunderwaffen is due to the fact that many of these projects were destroyed or left incomplete at the end of the war. Some documents disappeared and others were secretly taken by the Allies in the famous Operation Paperclip. For that reason, even today, theories circulate that mix reality and myth, imagining even Nazi flying saucers hidden in Antarctica. The Wunderwaffen represent the clash between science, desperation and propaganda, real weapons that changed military history, but also fertile ground for speculation and enigmas that continue to fascinate researchers and enthusiasts of the Second World War. The flight of Amelia Earhart and the war. The mystery of Amelia Earhart's flight has fascinated the world since 1937, when the famous aviator disappeared over the Pacific while attempting to fly around the planet. Although her disappearance occurred 2 years before the start of the Second World War, with the outbreak of the conflict, theories arose that linked her directly to the war and to possible secret operations. Earhart and her co-pilot, Fred Noonan, took off on what would be one of the most complicated stages of their journey. The route between Papua New Guinea and Howland Island, Guinea, and the tiny Howland Island in the Central Pacific. They never reached their destination, and radio records indicate that they suffered navigation problems. The official search, the most expensive conducted up to that time, found no conclusive remains of the plane or its crew. However, as the war in the Pacific approached, surprising hypotheses began to circulate. One of the most widespread holds that Earhart was actually working for the United States government, carrying out a covert reconnaissance flight over territories controlled by Japan. According to this version, she would have been captured in the Marshall Islands by Japanese forces and taken to Saipan, where some claim she died in captivity. Testimonies from island inhabitants collected decades later fueled this possibility, although there was never definitive proof. Another theory states that Amelia survived and returned to the United States under a new identity, living the rest of her life in secret. For some, her disappearance was used by the Americans as an excuse to investigate Japanese positions in the Pacific, which would make the aviator an involuntary piece of the prelude to the conflict. To this day, the whereabouts of Earhart and Noonan remain a mystery. What is clear is that her disappearance became a myth that transcended aviation, entering the history of the Second World War as a legend filled with secrets, suspicions, and theories that still divide researchers. The treasure of Erwin Rommel. The so-called Rommel's treasure is one of the most fascinating enigmas of the Second World War. The story goes that in 1943, when Field Marshal Erwin Rommel was in the midst of the campaign in North Africa, the troops of the Afrika Korps seized large quantities of gold, jewels, works of art, and valuable objects from banks, museums, and wealthy families of Tunisia and Libya. This loot, according to various testimonies, was loaded into metal chests and transported by sea to Europe with the intention of financing German operations and securing resources for the future. The ship that carried the treasure, a German freighter, is said to have departed from the port of Bizerte in 1943, bound for Marseille. However, it never reached its destination. There are theories claiming that the vessel was sunk in the Mediterranean by Allied forces, which would have left the treasure at the bottom of the sea. Other accounts suggest that Rommel, aware of the imminent end of the African campaign, ordered the cargo to be hidden somewhere along the Corsican coast or in secret coves in Italy, so that it could be recovered after the war. Over the decades, professional divers, treasure hunters, and adventurers have tried to locate it without success. In Corsica, for example, stories passed down by fishermen speak of mysterious chests dragged by currents, while in southern France, versions circulate about secret tunnels where the cargo might have been stored. The truth is that no conclusive evidence has ever been found. Neither official documents nor maps have confirmed the whereabouts of those riches. This has further fueled the myth. Does Rommel's treasure really exist, or was it a post-war invention? Did it sink into the depths of the Mediterranean, or does it remain hidden in some forgotten cave in Europe? To this day, the mystery continues to attract researchers and adventurers, turning Rommel's treasure into one of the most enduring legends of the Second World War. The case of the Luftwaffe flight MH370. The so-called Luftwaffe flight MH370 does not refer to a modern airplane, but rather to an enigma from the Second World War that recalls the mystery of the missing Malaysian plane. It concerns a German military transport that departed in 1945 from Prague toward Germany, bound for Munich or Berlin, according to different versions, in the final days of the Third Reich. What makes this case fascinating is that the aircraft, loaded with Nazi officers, secret documentation, and even, according to some theories, treasures, disappeared without a trace in the middle of Europe. At a time when the skies were being watched by both the Allies and the Soviets, the Luftwaffe, by then collapsing, used desperate flights to evacuate personnel, archives, and riches toward areas still controlled by the Nazis. In that context, this plane took off with the mission of saving key pieces of the regime. it never reached its destination. There were no records of its crash, no remains or survivors were found, and to this day it is unknown what exactly it carried inside. Over the decades, the mystery has given rise to multiple theories. Some researchers maintain that it was secretly shot down and destroyed by the Allies to conceal the loot. Others believe that it crashed in the Alps or in some remote forest, and that the wreckage was never discovered. There is also the idea that it carried gold, looted artworks, or even documentation linked to the darkest projects of the Third Reich. The case continues to be compared to Flight MH370 because of the similarity in its enigmatic nature, a plane full of secrets that simply vanished in an era when nothing should have gone unnoticed. To this day, no conclusive evidence has been found, and the phantom flight of the Luftwaffe remains one of the most intriguing mysteries of the Second World War. Yamashita's gold. The so-called Yamashita's gold is one of the great mysteries of the Second World War, a mixture of history, plunder, and legend. According to numerous testimonies, the Japanese general Tomoyuki Yamashita, famous for his campaigns in Southeast Asia, allegedly oversaw the transfer of enormous quantities of treasures looted from occupied countries: gold, jewels, religious relics, and works of art. These spoils were said to have been taken to the Philippines with the intention of being later sent to Japan, but Japan's defeat in 1900-145 thwarted those plans. The most widespread version claims that before the surrender, the Japanese hid the treasure in tunnels, caves, and bunkers built in the Philippines, sealing them with explosives and at times burying workers alive to keep the secret. It is said that dozens of such hiding places existed throughout the islands, with values reaching billions of current dollars. After the war, Yamashita was captured by the Americans and tried for war crimes, being executed in 1946 without revealing anything about the gold. However, since then, multiple theories have arisen. Some maintain that American agents found part of the treasure and used it to finance secret operations during the Cold War. Others believe that powerful families in the Philippines, including that of dictator Ferdinand Marcos, took possession of portions of the loot, building private fortunes from it. The searches never ceased. Treasure hunters, governments, and independent researchers have devoted decades to tracking the supposed hiding places. Some claim to have found ingots or chests, although there has never been conclusive proof confirming the true magnitude of this treasure. The enigma persists. Was it a propagandistic invention, a myth inflated by time, or does there truly exist a hidden treasure still waiting to be discovered? Yamashita's gold continues to inspire expeditions, documentaries, and theories, representing one of the most intriguing and obscure chapters of the war's end in the Pacific. Numerical coincidences before Pearl Harbor. The numerical coincidences surrounding the attack on Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December of 1941 have intrigued historians, researchers, and even enthusiasts of the esoteric for decades. Beyond military strategy and political tensions, certain numbers seem to repeat themselves around this event that changed the course of the Second World War, raising the question of whether they were mere coincidences or hidden patterns that have never been fully explained. The attack occurred on the 7th day of the 12th month, and in Japanese military history, the number 7 had always held special symbolism. The operation was executed by 6 aircraft carriers, which launched a total of 353 fighter and bomber planes, a figure that also sums to 11, a number that many analysts associate with events of great historical and symbolic weight. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the attack, had previously warned that Japan could fight successfully against the United States for exactly 1.5 years, which in the end was fulfilled almost precisely from December of 1941 until mid-1943, when the balance began to tilt toward the Allies. Another coincidence lies in the number of victims, 2,403 dead, a figure that for some researchers bears a strange parallel with other American disasters where numerical patterns seem to repeat, as occurred on the 11th of September of 2001. Even the fact that the exact date, 7/12, adds up to 19, has led to speculation about historical cycles that mark surprise attacks in human history. Although most historians regard these coincidences as mere curiosities without real relevance for others, they remain a reminder of how humanity seeks patterns amid chaos. Pearl Harbor was, without doubt, a strategically planned act by Japan, but the numbers surrounding it continue to fuel theories that oscillate between mathematics, symbolism, and historical mystery. The PQ-17 convoy in the Arctic. The PQ-17 convoy is remembered as one of the greatest naval disasters of the Second World War and, at the same time, as a mystery that still generates debate among historians. In June of 1942, a total of 35 Allied merchant ships departed from Iceland loaded with weapons, vehicles, airplanes, fuel, and vital supplies destined for the Soviet Union, which at that time was resisting the onslaught of the German invasion. To protect this invaluable cargo, the convoy was escorted by British and American warships, including cruisers, destroyers, and corvettes, as well as the limited air support that could be provided in those freezing latitudes. The route was extremely dangerous. The convoys crossing the Arctic were exposed to ice storms, the constant threat of German submarines, and the siege of the Luftwaffe operating from bases in Norway. However, what happened to PQ-17 exceeded the most pessimistic expectations. On the 4th of July, after receiving intelligence reports about the imminent departure of the German battleship Tirpitz to intercept the operation, the British Admiralty made a fateful decision. It ordered the convoy to disperse and withdrew the main escort, leaving the merchant ships practically defenseless in the Arctic waters. The result was devastating. Ship after ship was sunk by German submarines and airplanes that found the Allied vessels isolated and unprotected. Of the 35 merchant ships that departed, only 11 managed to reach port in the Soviet Union. Thousands of tons of supplies were lost, hundreds of men perished, and most strikingly, doubt was sown about the true nature of the British decision. Was it simply a monumental strategic mistake, or was there manipulated information that led to the deliberate dismantling of the operation? To this day, the documents and testimonies do not completely dispel those suspicions. The truth is that the Tirpitz never appeared in the area, and the ships that could have protected the convoy remained at a distance, obeying the order. Some historians believe it was an excess of caution in the face of German naval power, while others suggest that Allied intelligence was deceived by Nazi disinformation. PQ-17 not only represented a human and material tragedy, but also became a bitter example of how uncertainty and fear could change the course of the war. Amid the Arctic ice, the convoy left behind a trail of destruction and unanswered questions that still float like a spectre in the naval history of the conflict. The enigma of Raul Wallenberg. Raul Wallenberg is one of the great enigmas of the Second World War and of 20th century history. A Swedish diplomat, he arrived in Hungary in 1944 with the mission of saving the Jews of Budapest from deportation to Nazi extermination camps. Using his ingenuity and courage, he created Swedish protective passports, founded safe houses with diplomatic flags, and directly confronted German and Hungarian officers to stop transports to Auschwitz. It is estimated that he managed to save more than 100,000 people, becoming a true symbol of humanity in the face of barbarism. However, his personal fate became a mystery. In January of 1945, when the Red Army entered Budapest, Wallenberg was detained by the NKVD, the Soviet secret police. The Soviets suspected that he was an American spy, and from that moment his trail became confused. Moscow claimed years later that he had died of a heart attack in prison in 1947, but never delivered conclusive proof or a body. For decades, rumors circulated that he was still alive, imprisoned under another identity in some Soviet gulag. Testimonies from prisoners claim to have seen a Swedish diplomat years after the official date of his death. Sweden, Israel, the United States, and numerous international organizations pressured the Soviet Union to clarify his case, but silence and evasions continued. Even after the fall of the Soviet regime in 1991, the truth never fully came to light. Raul Wallenberg remains a hero without a known grave, a man who saved thousands but became a victim of post-war political intrigues. His legacy lives on in the testimonies of those he rescued, but his disappearance remains an open wound and one of the most perplexing mysteries of the Second World War. The ghost flight of the Allied bombers. The so-called ghost flight of the Allied bombers is one of the most unsettling mysteries of the Second World War, an episode that has left more questions than answers and that still today arouses fascination. The best-known story occurred on the 23rd of November of 1944, when an American B-17 bomber, later nicknamed the Ghost of Metfield, appeared flying over the skies of England. The plane maintained its course with the engines running, but something bewildering was happening. There was no one on board. Finally, the aircraft crashed into a field without causing civilian casualties. When soldiers examined the plane, what they found seemed taken from a nightmare. Seats occupied by jackets, remnants of food served in the cabin, and no sign of the crew. The initial investigation revealed that the crew members had parachuted at some point during the mission, but it was never clarified why they did so if the plane showed no combat damage or serious mechanical problems. The B-17 was airworthy, which makes the decision to abandon it incomprehensible. Moreover, the parachutes were found intact in some cases, and not all members of the crew were ever located. This was not an isolated event. There are reports of other bombers and fighters that returned alone to Allied bases in Italy, France, or England without pilots or crew. In some cases, planes were found crashed with empty cockpits, without signs of struggle, gunfire, or evident emergencies. These stories began to circulate among soldiers and officers, fueling rumors of strange phenomena, military cover-ups, and even paranormal theories. Historians have proposed various explanations. Some suggest that extreme stress, fear, and psychological pressure led crews to abandon their planes prematurely in response to false alarms of fire or mechanical failure. Others believe that it could have been communication errors amid chaotic battles, where panic played a decisive role. The hypothesis has also been raised that some cases were manipulated or silenced in official reports to avoid demoralizing the troops. However, none of these arguments manages to fully explain the scene of the Metfield B-17. A plane in perfect condition, engines roaring, flying alone until it crashed as if its men had vanished into thin air. The ghost flight of the Allied bombers thus became one of the most haunting legends of the conflict. A story that reflects not only the visible horrors of war, but also those enigmas that remain hidden among incomplete archives, official silences, and memories that seem to defy logic. A reminder that even amid the most advanced war machinery, mystery always finds a place to survive. The mystery of the missing submarines. The mystery of the submarines that disappeared during the Second World War is one of the most persistent and perplexing enigmas of the conflict. Between 1939 and 1945, both the Allies and the Axis lost hundreds of these vessels in the world's oceans. Many were sunk in combat, attacked by depth charges or enemy torpedoes, but what is most intriguing is that dozens of them were never found. Entire submarines, along with their crews, vanished without a trace, and even today, more than 80 years later, their fates remain the subject of investigation and speculation. One of the most famous cases is that of the U-boat that disappeared in 1944 near the Atlantic coast. The Kriegsmarine's naval records reported one last routine communication, with no emergency signals. After that, absolute silence. Decades later, researchers and marine explorers have tried to locate it with advanced technology, but it was never found. Something similar happened with several Allied submarines, such as the USS Grunion, lost in 1942 in the Pacific without any clear explanation at that time. Only in 2007, after 65 years of mystery, were its remains discovered in the Aleutians, although the exact circumstances of its sinking are still not entirely clear. Records from the time show that many of these disappearances occurred under conditions that did not fit an enemy attack. Submarines sailing far from combat zones simply stopped reporting. Some historians maintain that technical failures, internal explosions, or navigation errors could have been responsible. However, in certain cases, the absence of distress signals or floating debris fuels theories of military cover-ups, secret operations, and even experimental tests with undocumented weaponry. Among the most discussed mysteries is that of the U-196, which, according to rumors, reached Indonesia and then disappeared without any concrete evidence of its sinking. There are also stories about submarines that supposedly reached South America after the fall of the Third Reich, although most of these versions have never been proven. Over the years, international expeditions have discovered some of these iron cemeteries on the seabed, but dozens of cases remain unsolved. The missing submarines are, in a sense, time capsules trapped underwater, waiting to be rediscovered to tell the truth about what happened. The mystery of these vessels is not only technical or military, but also profoundly human. Behind each lost submarine were dozens of men who never returned home, and their families were left without answers. That void fuels fascination and interest in these cases, which still today continue to generate theories, investigations, and expeditions. In a conflict that left millions dead, the missing submarines remind us that even in the age of mechanized warfare and military intelligence, there were secrets the ocean chose to keep forever. Who revealed Anne Frank's hiding place? The story of Anne Frank is one of the most emblematic testimonies of the Holocaust, but also one of the most painful mysteries of the Second World War. Her famous diary, written during the 2 years she remained hidden with her family in the secret annex of Amsterdam, is a universal work that recounts with heartbreaking honesty daily life under the constant threat of being discovered. However, the question that has haunted entire generations is, who betrayed the Frank family and revealed their hiding place to the Gestapo? On the 4th of August of 1944, agents of the German police stormed the hiding place at number 263 Prinsengracht, arresting the 8 occupants, among them Anne, her parents Otto and Edith, her sister Margot, and the Van Pels family. Shortly afterward, it was known that someone had disclosed the location, but the identity of the traitor was never confirmed. Over the decades, multiple hypotheses have emerged. Some pointed to Willem van Maren, an employee of Otto Frank's business, who supposedly suspected strange movements in the company. Others accused Nelly Voskiel, sister of Bepp, one of the helpers who assisted the Franks, who had sympathies with the Nazis. There was even talk of a failed robbery in the warehouse that could have attracted the attention of the authorities and caused a fortuitous raid. In 2016, new investigations suggested that Arnold van den Berg, a Jewish notary from Amsterdam, might have been responsible. According to this hypothesis, van den Berg handed over lists of Jewish hiding places to protect his own family. However, other historians consider this theory weak and based on circumstantial evidence. The truth is that the official documents about the arrest are incomplete, and many key witnesses died without leaving definitive testimony. The Anne Frank Fonds itself, the organization that manages Anne's legacy, maintains that no culprit can be identified with certainty. Otto Frank, the only survivor among those in hiding, avoided directly accusing anyone, aware that there would never be irrefutable proof. The mystery persists and perhaps will never be solved. For some, what matters is not discovering the informant, but remembering the context of hatred, fear, and repression in which Anne lived. Anyone could have spoken, voluntarily or involuntarily, in a time when betrayal meant avoiding deportation or retaliation. The question of who revealed Anne Frank's hiding place remains without a clear answer, but her story continues to be a universal symbol of resistance in the face of barbarism. The true legacy lies not in identifying the culprit, but in ensuring that new generations never forget what happened. The Japanese Balloon Bomb Project, FUGO. The Japanese balloon bomb project, known as FUGO, was one of the most unusual and mysterious attempts of the Second World War. It was a secret program of the Japanese Empire designed with the goal of bringing the war directly to the continental territory of the United States, something that until then had seemed unthinkable. Between 1944 and 1945, the Japanese army launched more than 9,000 balloons equipped with incendiary and explosive bombs, taking advantage of a high-altitude jet stream that crossed the Pacific and could carry the devices thousands of kilometers away. These balloons, built mainly with reinforced rice paper and bamboo, had a self-regulating mechanism that controlled altitude by releasing sand or gas to keep them stable during flight. The idea was that upon reaching North America, the devices would cause massive forest fires in sparsely populated regions in the hope of generating chaos, civilian casualties, and demoralizing the American population. The first reports of these strange objects began to arrive at the end of 1944, when American civilians and soldiers observed explosions or found balloon remains in forests and mountains. Although most failed to cause significant damage, some did achieve their purpose. The most tragic case occurred on the 5th of May of 1945 in Oregon, when a pregnant woman and 5 children died after handling one of these balloons that had landed, becoming the only mortal victims on American soil directly caused by an enemy attack during the Second World War. The reaction of the American authorities was initially one of surprise and confusion. To avoid panic and to prevent giving Japan useful information about the success of its campaign, the government implemented strict press control, censoring news related to the balloon bombs. This worked, as the Japanese never received confirmation of the impacts and considered the project a failure, which led to its suspension in 1945. Over time, the mystery and fascination with the Fugo project grew. Many balloons were never found, and even today remains are discovered in remote places in the United States, Canada, and even Mexico. Some researchers believe that this was the first attempt at intercontinental warfare, a precursor idea to what would later become long-range ballistic missiles. The Japanese balloon bomb project is a reminder that even in the midst of a war dominated by tanks, planes, and aircraft carriers, there was room for unusual experiments that combined ingenuity, desperation, and the hope of changing the course of the conflict. Its legacy lives on not only as a historical rarity, but also as an enigma that demonstrates how far nations at war were willing to go to surprise the enemy. The fate of Mussolini's treasure. The fate of Mussolini's treasure is one of the most intriguing mysteries of the Second World War and blends the fall of fascism with intrigues of gold, jewels, and secrets never clarified. When Benito Mussolini's regime collapsed in April of 1945 and the dictator tried to flee toward the Swiss border, he did not do so empty-handed. Various testimonies indicate that his convoys were loaded with a treasure composed of gold ingots, coins, jewels, religious objects, and even confidential documents that could compromise Axis figures and even foreign personalities. The loot, known as the Dongo treasure, is said to have departed from Milan together with Mussolini and his lover Clara Petacci, protected by a group of loyal fascists. The story tells that on the 27th of April of 1945, Mussolini was captured at Lake Como by Italian partisans, who also seized several suitcases and trunks traveling with him. The next day, the dictator and Petacci were executed in Mezzegra, but what happened to the confiscated riches remains an enigma. Some partisans claim to have seen boxes full of gold and jewels, while others mentioned secret documents related to agreements between fascism, Nazism, and Western governments. However, shortly afterward, much of these goods disappeared. The theories about the fate of the treasure are multiple. One holds that it was looted by the partisans themselves, who divided it among themselves in a clandestine booty that never came to light. Another hypothesis suggests that the gold and jewels were secretly handed over to the new Italian government, but much of them vanished in political corruption operations during the post-war period. There are also accounts claiming that part of the treasure was transferred by American intelligence, interested in the documents that could reveal secret contacts between the fascist regime and the Allied powers before the end of the war. The mystery deepens with post-war reports mentioning sightings of the Dongo gold in Switzerland or in Vatican banks, though conclusive evidence was never found. It has even been suggested that the treasure may have financed Nazi escape networks to South America, known as the Rat Lines. To this day, only small fragments of the loot have appeared in private collections or museums, but the bulk of Mussolini's treasure remains missing. Its whereabouts form a puzzle that combines greed, state secrets, and international conspiracies. A hidden legacy that turns the dictator's end into an even darker story and reminds us how, in the final days of fascism, power and wealth vanished into the shadow of defeat. The mystery of the Nazi freighter Doggerbank. The German freighter Doggerbank is one of those naval enigmas of the Second World War that, to this day, remains surrounded by mystery and speculation. Originally a British merchant ship, the Speybank, it was captured in 1940 by the Kriegsmarine and converted into a raider vessel under the German flag. Renamed Doggerbank, it was assigned to secret missions on the high seas, transporting weapons, spare parts, munitions, and, according to some accounts, also special cargoes that might have included gold, precious metals, or compromising documents of the Third Reich. On the 3rd of January of 1943, the Doggerbank departed from the Japanese port of Yokohama, bound for Europe, loaded with 7,000 tons of strategic supplies. Its final destination was Germany, and it had to cross the dangerous Indian and Atlantic Oceans in the midst of war, a high-risk journey due to constant Allied surveillance. For its protection, it was disguised as a British ship to go unnoticed in case of encounters at sea. However, the unexpected occurred weeks later. In the Atlantic, the German submarine U-43, commanded by Captain Hans-Joachim Schwantke, sighted what he believed was an enemy vessel and attacked without hesitation. Several torpedoes struck the Doggerbank, which sank rapidly, taking with it almost its entire crew and the mysterious cargo it carried. Of the more than 300 people on board, only a few managed to survive in lifeboats, and of them only one was rescued weeks later, becoming the only direct source of testimony about the tragedy. The accidental sinking of a German ship by another German ship was an unusual event, but what truly fueled the mystery was the secrecy surrounding the lost cargo. Some researchers suggest that the Doggerbank was transporting gold ingots and precious stones as payment from Germany to Japan for raw materials, a treasure that would have remained buried in the Atlantic. Others claim it also carried advanced technology, weapon blueprints, and even uranium materials the Nazis intended to exchange with their Asian allies. The Kriegsmarine's secrecy after the sinking seems to confirm that it was not a simple freighter with ordinary supplies. To this day, the exact location of the sinking remains uncertain. Numerous search expeditions have tried to locate the wreck of the Doggerbank and recover its possible treasure, but none have succeeded. The combination of a fatal mistake, an enigmatic cargo, and Nazi official silence turned this episode into one of the most enduring maritime legends of the Second World War. The Doggerbank is not only the story of a tragic error, but also that of a secret sunk with the sea. Was it truly a strategic cargo that disappeared in the depths, or a hidden treasure that still waits to be discovered? The mystery, like the ship itself, remains buried beneath the waters of the Atlantic.